Hello everybody, and at the time of recording this video, it's actually Christmas, so happy holidays. Hopefully I can post this on Christmas Day, or maybe sometime after Christmas Day. So in this video, there's no script. I'm just going to be reading off of my notes that I have here on my Substack website. So if you haven't subscribed to the Substack, please go do so. But before I even continue, I have to give a disclaimer. Not a doctor. This isn't a guide that you guys should just be, using flippantly. So consult with a medical professional. Do everything at your own risk. But that being said, I'm going to be talking about the various hair loss stacks that I've seen from my clients and my various consultations, because I do non-medical hair loss consultations where I talk about my opinion, and I also give some non-clinical, I guess you can say, advice. This article that I made have a bit of an outline, the stacks and my take on them. So it comes with basic components. You have your hair follicle growth stimulants. You also have your topical antiandrogens, which are a bit more experimental. You also have the 5-alpha reductase inhibitors and what I call the topical minoxidil synergistic enhancement. So these are things that when paired alongside with minoxidil, it increases its efficacy. So without further ado, let's start from the beginnings. So this particular brand over here is the Minoxidil Max brand of minoxidil, but this can also work with the Kirkland brand. This is the typical minoxidil. This would work as well, but this is the 5% topical version. Every hair loss stack that I've seen, and I'm sure you guys know this, it's always recommended that you take minoxidil, right? It has always been this sort of basis of any starter or beginner hair loss stack. In fact, some people, that's all they need is minoxidil and oral finasteride, and that's pretty much it, which we will be covering and looking at later on in this video. Minoxidil has to be converted by an enzyme called sulfur-transferase enzyme, or sulfur-transferase, or SALT1A1 human, and it is actually minoxidil sulfate after this conversion, right? When sulfur-transferase comes in contact with minoxidil, it turns into minoxidil sulfate. It is actually minoxidil sulfate that is responsible for helping hair follicles remain in that prolonged state of anagen growth. But next we have stamoxidine, and not many people know about stamoxidine. Now, stamoxidine is a P4H inhibitor that creates a hypoxia-like environment in the scalp, and it's used alongside with minoxidil to combat the shedding associated with minoxidil sometimes, and also shedding in general. This P4H inhibitor helps start the hair growth cycle earlier. It helps start the anagen cycle earlier after a shed, right? Because after the hair follicle lets go of a hair, there's this sort of period of dormancy where it's not growing any hair. And if you use this P4H inhibitor, stamoxidine, it kind of kickstarts the growth process sooner than it would otherwise be. And the upside about stamoxidine is that you can use this 3 months on, 3 months off. It's actually designed to be used in 3-month cycles. And your hair follicles do not become addicted to them or reliant on them for growth like they do with. So up next we have latanoprost. I think you guys know what latanoprost is, or the sort of prostaglandin analog. There's another drug that we'll look at later called bimatoprost. And latanoprost, bimatoprost, and even another drug called travoprost were all used for treating glaucoma, this sort of eye condition that causes your eye lens to become very foggy. What they noticed is that when they started using these drugs for patients that had glaucoma, their eyelashes started to thicken and become longer. And this became a drug called bimatoprost that was incorporated into Latisse. And Latisse, for some people who don't know in the audience, is that sort of eyelash growth stimulant, but women use it to grow their eyelashes, or people in general use it to grow their eyelashes. And that actually works, right? Minoxidil is known as this sort of primary treatment for hair loss. And in some studies, it has been noted to interact with prostaglandin production in several notable ways. It stimulates the production of prostaglandin E2, or PGE2, I think that's what it's called, which is this sort of fatty acid compound that plays various roles in the body, including the modulation of hair growth. And like I said, we saw that sort of modulation of hair growth with bimatoprost, another prostaglandin analog that grew the eyelashes of people that were using this glaucoma eye drop drug. Now, this stimulation occurs through the activation of COX-1 and prostaglandin endoperoxide synthase 1, both of which are enzymes involved in the biosynthesis of prostaglandin. While minoxidil promotes the production of PGE2, minoxidil simultaneously inhibits the production of another prostaglandin that is responsible for suppressing hair growth. And this sort of prostaglandin, the negative prostaglandins, inflammatory effects. So minoxidil actually gets rid of these bad prostaglandins and reduces the inflammation. So there's a sort of anti-inflammatory effect when minoxidil is used. So we have topical antiandrogens. Now, this section is very experimental. I have to say, use it at your own risk. I'm not going to tell you should be using it or you shouldn't be using it, but we're doing research here, so we'll be talking about it as so. So I've noticed in some of my clients that they use RU58841, and this is an experimental topical anti-androgen with a focus of kind of binding to the androgen receptor and blocking DHT binding to the androgen receptor of the hair follicles. And if you do that, ideally, DHT's damaging effects will not be transcribed to the hair follicle to essentially suppress its growth and have it miniaturize and eventually just not grow hair anymore. And now you have the most recent sort of topical anti-androgen that I think, and it had a pretty disappointing phase 3 update. Or Suzhou Kintor from China, the pharmaceutical company that's responsible for creating pyrrolitamide and clinically testing it right now, they put out a bit of a somber update that essentially said that in phase 3 clinical trial testing, it was found there was no statistical significance in pyrrolitamide treatment group versus the placebo group. But nevertheless, I've already speculated on a different video where I talk about how maybe the concentration of pyrrolitamide that they used, the 0.5% concentration, was a bit low, and I compared that with RU58841 because in RU58841 from what we know about the human clinical trials, and especially what was used in animal models like the stump-tail macaque monkeys, they used a 5% concentration. And if you look at the molecular weight, because some people are disappointed, they think that pyrrolitamide isn't working due to its higher molecular weight, which may very well be true. It could be much more challenging for pyrrolitamide, in accordance to the Dalton rule. It could be much more challenging for pyrrolitamide to reach into the deeper layers of the epidermis to reach the hair follicle androgen receptors because it has that high molecular weight, right? And if it has a higher molecular weight, why is it being used at a low concentration of 0.5%, right? Like I said, RU58841, it has a lower molecular weight than pyrrolitamide, but it exists at a higher concentration from what it is conventionally used to combat androgenetic alopecia. So I essentially stated in that video that it would be more prudent, or would have been prudent for Kintor to test KX826 or pyrrolitamide at a higher concentration, probably 5%. Not even that high, maybe 2% versus 5% versus 8%. But nevertheless, I include this into my list because I've seen people use it in their stacks, and they've had some success with it, so I'm going to include it. Next, we have topilutamide, or Fluoridil. Now, this particular topical antiandrogen works the same way as RU58841, works the same way as KX826 or pyrrolitamide. And the goal of this topical antiandrogen is to reach the androgen receptor, block it, so DHT can't bind to the androgen receptor of the hair follicle and transcribe those damaging effects to the hair follicle. Now, with Fluoridil or topilutamide, it has this sort of feature of hydrolysis, right? So when it comes in contact with water, it immediately breaks apart. So you have to use this on a dry scalp so it doesn't prematurely cause the hydrolysis, rendering the treatment ineffective. So if you do use topilutamide or Fluoridil, you have to make sure your scalp's dry, and that's just the gist of it, right? Next we have topical spirolactolone, and this is another sort of topical anti-androgen that's used to treat acne, to combat acne, and also it's used for women who have hairoticism, and that is like facial hair growth, right? But It's also used in men to combat androgenetic alopecia, to bind to block DHT from having sort of harmful effects on those hair follicles, right? So it can lower testosterone, it can mess with you a bit, but that's just the risk we have to contend with. But overall, it's pretty safe though. I do have to stress that overall, it does have a pretty good safety profile. It's just that we tend not to use spironolactone on men, and a lot of men shy away from it because of its potential impact to serum testosterone. Realistically, when you use any topical anti-androgen, you have to accept that there will be some degree of systemic absorption, right? It's whether or not that systemic absorption is ample enough to cause anti-androgenic effects in the body. That's what we have to kind of gauge out. But in terms of systemic absorption, Floridil, that hydrolytic nature, right? The fact that it breaks down in the presence of water kind of makes it, in theory, have no systemic side effects because your blood is made out of water. So if it does go deep enough into the scalp and then goes to the bloodstream, well, it would break down due to its hydrolytic nature, right? And we also have alfortridiol. This is some sort of, topical anti-androgen, and it works the same way. The goal of it is to reduce the impacts of androgens on the hair follicle without significant systemic side effects. And I've seen people use this alternative to minoxidil and also alternative to RU58841. From what I remember, it is approved in Germany, but from the pictures that I've seen of alfortridiol, it doesn't look that impressive. It looks like it has the same sort of therapeutic benefit as topical minoxidil at 2%. So over here now we have our 5-alpha reductase inhibitors. You guys all know this. Finasterid is a type 2 5-alpha reductase inhibitor. When you take finasterid, it reduces serum DHT by 70% and scalp DHT by, I think, 30 to 40%. And this is with the 1 milligram or 5 milligram dose, because above 1 milligram, you're not getting any sort of additional benefit like you do with dutasteride. So with dutasteride, you have, it blocks type 1 and type 2, and even type 3 5-alpha reductase enzymes. Also, between the 0.5 milligram to 2.5 milligram, it reduces serum DHT by, I think, 92 to 95%, and scalp DHT between 50 to 80%. So that's pretty substantial. And I already did a whole talk about this. You can check my video. I think it's called Hair Loss Stack Lecture. So I'll link it in the description if you guys want to go check it out. And yeah, we have topical dutasteride and finasteride. Works similarly, the same way to oral treatments of finasteride and dutasteride, but you're using it topically, so it has a much more localized effect. So there's that. Section, the topical minoxidil synergistic enhancements. So tretinoin is used alongside with minoxidil because it has been found to increase sulfur transferase activity by way of cell turnover rate. So when you use tretinoin or any sort of topical retinoid or a topical vitamin A, right? This is a class of medicine, of drugs, right? When you use these topical retinoids, it increases the turnover rate of your skin cells, right? And in doing so, this increases the sulfur transferase activity. It also allows for minoxidil to penetrate deeper into the scalp. Now, if you increase sulfur transferase activity, you're increasing the amount of minoxidil that turns into minoxidil sulfate. Now remember, hair follicles don't grow hair or don't enter in extended anagen phases primarily because of minoxidil. It is required for minoxidil to turn into minoxidil sulfate by coming in contact with the sulfur transferase enzyme. So if you don't have an abundant presence of sulfur transferase on your scalp, and this is a genetic feature because some people have a lot of sulfur transferase, some people have none, and then you have people who are pretty much, in between with average amount, right? If you don't have enough sulfur transferase, you're not going to get a conversion to minoxidil sulfate. If you don't have a ample amount of minoxidil sulfate that, or I guess you can say a sufficient amount of minoxidil sulfate, then you're not going to be growing hair from hair follicles or having hair follicles in that sort of extended anagen growth phase, right? So if you do pair it with tretinoin or any sort of topical vitamin A, you have to make sure that you use the tretinoin along with minoxidil consistently, because the moment you drop one or the other, your hair is going to shed out, because you're artificially increasing the sulfur-transferase on the scalp. So that is why now you're starting to see telehealth companies incorporate minoxidil with tretinoin, because they want more, they want people to have better results, essentially, right? So you can find tretinoin compounded with minoxidil. You can check my description for the minoxidil max link to find that sort of particular, I guess you can say, minoxidil tretinoin compound. Or you can just get the cream, apply the cream on your scalp, and then use the minoxidil. Now, I do have to stress this: using any sort of topical vitamin A or retinoid, you have to be careful, because it can increase the photosensitivity of your skin. So this means if you're going outside, you have to put on sunscreen on that area that you've applied this sort of cream to, or wear a hat, try to cover that area, because it can increase your risk of sun damage to your skin and sunburn, and you can get all sort of like very nasty things if you do have sensitive skin. So just be careful if you do choose to put that on your scalp. So now it's time to look at the various hair loss stacks that I've given corny names to. So you have number 1, Follicle Fortitude Basic. This is oral finasteride, 1 milligram a day. Topical minoxidil, 5%. It should say 5% used every day, right? Or every night. Once a day, twice a day. Personally, when I was using minoxidil, I would use it once a day, typically towards the end of the day, and then I would go to bed. You have the Crown Guard Basic Prime. This is the oral finasteride, 1 milligram once a day. Topical minoxidil, 5% once a day. Tretinoin between the ranges of 0.1% concentration to 0.025% concentration, used once a day, alongside with minoxidil. And then you have this next one, the Lock Survival Prime 2, oral finasteride, 1 milligram a day, latanoprost, 0.1% to 0.01% to 0.1% a day. Now, like I said before, if you're using these things, now in this particular stack, right, there is no minoxidil. But if you do plan to use minoxidil in conjunction with latanoprost or tretinoin, you kind of have to continuously use these things, right? Because you're artificially increasing the amount of prostaglandins you have. And if you do that, you're also artificially increasing the amount of activity minoxidil has, right, on the anagen phase. You're essentially extending minoxidil's anagen phase capabilities by giving minoxidil more tools to use to grow the hair follicles and extend that anagen phase, right? Not only that, but if you're using tretinoin, you're increasing the amount of sulfur transferase that you have, which increases the amount of minoxidil sulfate. So if you kind of drop either of these things, you can potentially negatively impact minoxidil's effect on you, on your hair follicles. So that's something you have to be mindful of. But I can go through all these stacks. Like, I've had people talk about, hey, why can't I just use something that doesn't have minoxidil, right? Why can't I use a growth stimulant aside from minoxidil? And you can, right? Like in this sort of article that I wrote, you have the Dermal Defense Prime 5, which is pretty much oral dutasteride, 0.5 milligram a day with latanoprost, and it has no introduction of minoxidil. But if you drop latanoprost, you could also lose that sort of pro-androgen growth phase effects, right? You'll shed out your hair, essentially, is what I'm trying to say. Shed out your hair. Hopefully I didn't say shit out your hair. Anyway, oral dutasteride, topical minoxidil. This is sort of like a pretty big stack for number 7. You have oral dutasteride 0.5 milligram once a day, topical minoxidil 5% once a day, tretinoin between 0.01% to 0.025% once a day, latanoprost between 0.01% to 0.1% once a day. Again, that's a pretty hefty commitment. You also have this. This is the topical touch-up, but this uses topical minoxidil, 5%, once a day, tretinoin, same thing, once a day, topical dutasteride between 0.01 to 1% once a day. And then here's where we introduce microneedling, right? So between the ranges of 1.5 millimeter to 2 millimeter once a week. And when you use the microneedle on this day, you would also be pairing it with topical dutasteride. Now, I've made tons of videos on topical dutasteride alongside with microneedling, and also even mesotherapy dutasteride. I don't even cover mesotherapy dutasteride in this particular sort of, like, in my notes, right? That's for another day, if I do that. But I've already made a lot of videos on mesotherapy dutasteride, which you guys can go check out just by searching mesotherapy dutasteride on my channel. But it has been shown that because topical dutasteride has a higher molecular weight, there are ways to get around this sort of challenge to its absorption, right? You can either increase the concentration of the topical dutasteride solution, so the higher the concentration, the greater the absorption that you can get, and this is due to Fick's law, right? Because molecules like to go from an area of higher concentration to lower concentration. So if you increase it on the skin to, like, let's say you're using 1% topical dutasteride, that would fare better than 0.01% topical dutasteride. Now, you can microneedle. If you microneedle with topical dutasteride, you'll get a higher absorption into the scalp, and sometimes you can do this like once a week and apply topical dutasteride on the day you microneedle, right? And you probably don't have to apply topical dutasteride every single day, right? Some people get away with it by doing it 4 times a week, 3 times a week. I just say still apply it every single day just to get that consistent benefit, because after you microneedle, your your scalp or your skin just doesn't automatically like heal. It'll take some days to heal. But in that time that it takes to heal, that area that was microneedled will have a greater absorption, right? Until it kind of, the absorption will kind of like peak and then kind of fall down and go back to normal levels as the area heals itself. But I will say this though, I'm not even thinking about side effects when I talk about these topical 5-alpha reductase inhibitors like topical finasteride or topical dutasteride. I don't even think about that. My philosophy for this particular, I guess you can say, research guide is combating the local effects of DHT. How can we decrease scalp DHT to a greater extent? That's what I'm focused on, right? And by introducing microneedling and topical dutasteride, you're going to get a greater decrease than just using it on your scalp regularly, right? So I'm not concerned about systemic absorption here. I'm concerned about saturating the scalp with a sufficient amount of topical dutasteride that can suppress DHT. And this could even be paired with using oral dutasteride at 0.5 milligram, right? Or even 2.5 milligram. The goal is to suppress scalp DHT as much as possible, because it is the level of scalp DHT as well as your sensitivity to DHT that determines how long you keep your hair follicles if you have the condition of androgenetic alopecia, right? How long you keep those hair follicles active, healthy, and even in a state that can kind of reverse itself back from miniaturization to getting more thick, stronger terminal hairs. So, yeah. Now, that's pretty much it for this video. I think, to me, in my head, I've kind of been rambling on. I don't think I've been that coherent, but I'm still going to post this video eventually. But hopefully, you guys can check this out in the description, this particular article. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. But yeah, I wanted to just put some stacks together so people can explore what options they do have to address their hair loss issues, right? And I want to say this, please don't think that like these are like rigid, right? Like you can't change anything here. You have to be a bit wise here, right? If I told you that you're using topical minoxidil along with tretinoin because you want to boost sulfur transferase and get more minoxidil sulfate, you kind of have to realize that those things kind of have to be paired with each other, right? If you drop one or the other, you risk losing the gains that you make. You also have to realize that if you're using a prostaglandin analog like latanoprost, romatoprost, or travoprost, that if you use that in conjunction with minoxidil, right? If you drop either one of them, let's say you're using topical minoxidil, latanoprost, and tretinoin, if you drop one of them, you could impact your hair follicles. Because increasing the amount of prostaglandins you have helps minoxidil have more tools to prolong the anagen growth phase. Increasing or using tretinoin, right? If you use tretinoin, you're increasing the amount of sulfur transferase you have, so you get a higher amount of minoxidil sulfate, which could be used to grow more hair and have longer anagen growth phase. Now, if you mess with any of these, you can impact that sort of sensitive, I guess you can say, microenvironment for the hair follicle niche. You can impact that, and that can cause hair follicles to shed out, and you can, lose your gains. So you have to be very wise when you go into these sort of treatment protocols. And I always get questions, and I'm happy to answer them, but sometimes I feel like a lot of these things, a lot of these questions can be solved by, some people looking at the videos that I've already posted, but I'll be sure to answer what I can, but also leave some videos in the description that can help you guys. So, Merry Christmas, if I do post this in time for Christmas. It is actually Christmas right now. It's 7:41 p.m. here on the East Coast. I think you guys can probably hear my family laughing in the background. But, yeah, I just want to say thank you guys for all the support. And if you got to the end of this video, this long, rambling, seemingly incoherent for myself, admittedly, right? Comment in the comment section below, holiday cheer. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. Peace out.